I'm hopeful that Alabama workers will unionize at some point, but patient work in terms of organizing in the plant, overcoming people's fears in the long run, I think will bear fruit.
Professor Michael Goldfield is an esteemed academic, studier of labor history in the South in particular, the author of The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 40s. It's a great book. I just finished it, and really excited to be able to have this conversation with the professor. So, Professor Goldfield, thank you for taking the time to talking to us. Thank you for taking the time and talking to us today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Talking about the history of Alabama and Southern labor is one of my favorite things to do.
Yes, well, one of our favorite things to do as well, but obviously we are biased in a certain sense. But, you know, the biggest thing, obviously, in the South right now is, as far as labor is concerned, the biggest news item is the UAW's campaign to organize the non-union auto sector. They had last month a huge victory at Volkswagen, 73% of the workers voting in favor of unionization. And it seemed like, at least from the reporting and everything that we saw in the media, that there was potentially going to just be an unstoppable momentum, and the UAW was going to be able to ride that wave to the organization of at least a few more non-union plants before things started getting more and more difficult. And that momentum was kind of stopped pretty abruptly at the Mercedes plant, with workers there voting against unionization by about 11 or 12 points. It was 56-44 in terms of percentages against the union. And you know, I think there are some people that have said, you know, the momentum theory is there was probably a bit too much hype behind that. But it's going to be difficult everywhere, but also everywhere there's a real possibility of victory. So I'm just, being a studier of labor history, having spent decades and decades reading, you know, firsthand primary sources, other people's academic work, and you know, what are your first thoughts about the results from the Mercedes election and the UAW's campaign writ large?
Okay, well, I think you have to put this, to give a sober analysis, you have to put this in historical perspective. It was overhyped about the period of right now of labor ascendancy. While there have been a lot of exciting things going on, Starbucks organizing, the VW victory, the struggle of the Mercedes trucks in North Carolina and elsewhere. If we look at the data, union membership in the last year has gone up about 100,000, but percentage-wise, it's about the same as it was the year before. If we look at the upsurges nationally and in Alabama, 1918, 1919, when union membership in the country as a whole had doubled in 5 years, or in 1933, when Alabama and U.S. nationally coal miners organized, union membership went up 20% in 1 year. So this is not that type of ascendancy. Secondly, very large plants from powerful companies, and this includes steel plants in Pennsylvania and Illinois, not just in the South, are always much harder to organize than smaller than smaller enterprises. So we have a plant in Vance, 6,000 workers with a company with very deep pockets. And I would like to separate the type of opposition. A lot of the hype has to do with political opposition, governors and local people and whatnot. In my looking at labor history, this is almost never very relevant. What is that mostly it's noise unless they call out the troops and start bringing in scabs and shooting workers, which hasn't been going on that much in the current period. So I think It's a big plant. The opposition inside the plant by the company was very, very important. And the UAW itself feels that maybe they called the election too soon, and to sign up people to sign cards, they used digital technology rather than carefully recruiting people one-on-one inside the plant. So this was a difficult situation, and they lost. We'll see what happens. Volkswagen, they had been organizing for a long time. They lost 2 elections. And I think that Mercedes did pull out lots of stops. One of the things in the union playbook is to fire the plant manager and blame him for a lot of the problems in the plant. So there's a lot of factors here. So that's my initial assessment, and there's still more research to be done. But I think some of the other explanations that people give, Southern workers aren't prone to unionization. That's just not, and particularly in Alabama, that's just not true historically.
Yeah, that's been something that, as the dust has been settling, there have been at least a few, conservative commentators in Politico, and certainly the politicians really kind of trying to dance on what they perceive as the grave of this campaign, and attributing the loss of the UAW at the Mercedes plant to politics. They're saying that, these workers are conservative. These workers vote Republican, and the UAW wants a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, that was one of the things that I saw somebody say yesterday, and it's just like, I haven't read even a single interview where a single worker mentions the situation in Israel as a pro or a con, right? I mean, it's just not been a factor in the campaign as far as I can tell. And so, I mean, what is your reaction to people who are in this specific instance, and then we can broaden it out, but in this specific instance, attributing the loss to the culture and the politics, and are they doing this I guess, what's your reaction to that? And then why do you think they say that? Are they just dumb? They just don't know anything? Or is there some sort of self-flattery going on here? Or is it somehow beneficial for them to try to perpetuate this narrative about Southern workers? I'm interested in your thoughts on all of that.
So one of the calling cards in Alabama and throughout the South for well over a century has always been, come here. We pay workers less. Originally, it was because there was an agricultural economy in which people were barely getting by, and even working in textile plants was an improvement for people financially. And that continues to be their calling card. But in terms of openness to unions, in periods of ascendancy, Southern and Alabama workers in particular have always, when given the opportunity, have been very pro-union. So Alabama coal miners, which were the center of the Alabama labor movement from the late 19th century until the 1950s, as coal began to disappear in Alabama, were always at the forefront. They were leaders in the late 19th century strikes. They were among the first to organize in 1933, even before there were legislation passed. They were the biggest supporters of Big Jim Folsom in 1946 when he ran for first time for governor and the second time. And if we look at the periods of union ascendancy, in Birmingham, there was a steel election that the NLR that was run where the workers voted 300-2 in favor of the union. So we didn't have any hesitancy then. And I think that that continues to be the fate, the place, the type of repression by companies and the threats to people's jobs that they might be fired, not be employable, are very real. When unions are on the on the rise and on a roll, these things get pushed to the side. And I think this has been true in the South as well. So I don't think it's cultural. I think it's actually physical fear, class battles, loss of livelihood. These are real threats, and that's much more important than so-called culture. And there's always been an attempt to look at cultural explanations. So during the coal organizing, union organizers were shot, workers were shot, and workers in Alabama and elsewhere armed. And they said, oh, this is cultural. This is a gun culture. No, this was self-defense. And so there's always an attempt to look at cultural factors when they're really secondary, particularly in terms of union organizing. At least that's my cut on things. And as some examples of how little impact the political elites have on union organizing in Mississippi, which was even more repressive than Alabama and didn't have the political support of unions and a governor who was sympathetic to unions. In 1947, in Laurel, Mississippi, when the textile workers came to organize and they were supported by other unionized workers in Laurel, Senator Bilbo and Congressman Rankin, among the most racist anti-union of politicians, came to town and campaigned against the unions, and the union workers, including the overwhelming majority of white workers, voted 5-1 for the union. And there are lots of examples where workers put their own unionization 100 times ahead of any rhetoric that political elites gave about why they shouldn't vote for the union. So
one of the, I think just one more illustration, and I think that, forgive me for using a reference that's not from your book, but maybe you'll recognize it, was from the coal miners in Alabama during, really the depths of Jim Crow, and as the, I think it was 1905 that this incident happened. Immediately following the rewriting of the Constitution by racist white supremacist redeemers, the coal miners union, which was always interracial in Alabama. It wasn't perfect. Black people were not allowed to be president at the time, but black people were elected to vice president, and so they were there were black folks in the hierarchy above white folks in this union in Alabama post 1901. And before 1901, but post is kind of more interesting. And in the Birmingham Labor Council, there was a move to segregate the hall, or it was either segregate the hall or not allow. I think it was not allow black people in the hall at all. And the UMW said, you're not going to do that, or we're going to disaffiliate from you. And that is, talking about how the cultural explanations kind of fall flat. There was no stronger culture in Alabama immediately post 1901 than white supremacy. And this union of black and white workers stood up against it. The cultural explanations really do continuously fall flat, and textiles in particular, you were alluding to there, there's a big like religious component that people ascribe to the textile workers, it seems, as one of the reasons why they didn't organize. Speaking about, religion specifically, how has that argument fallen flat when we're talking about culture, narrowing it to religion in the context of union organizing in the South?
Yeah, so the history of it. So Alabama had a big textile industry, but it was much smaller than North Carolina, which had the biggest, and also South Carolina and whatnot. But the Alabama textile workers were the most militant in the country and the most pro-union, the first to organize. They forced the 1934 general strike, and they were supported by the coal miners in doing this. They had 100% unionization throughout the state. And they had the confidence that they had support of a powerful labor movement within Alabama. So in terms of people's lives, what they spend 8, 10, or 12 hours a day, and in Vance and Mercedes, there's lots of forced overtime, as there is in all these non-union plants. I worked for 9 years in an international harvester plant outside of Chicago, and we had a right to turn down overtime. And they had to tell us in advance when they wanted us to work. Workers at these non-union transplants do not have any of these rights. And these are the predominating things that happen. I worked on an assembly line for 9 years. I was much younger than I am now, but people's bodies break down. This is rough work. No matter how ergonomically it's designed, people hold pneumatic tools above their head. They do all sorts of things that repetitive motions that destroy their bodies. And if you're injured permanently, the company lets you go. You don't have any rights to continuance of your pay, your job, or anything else. So these are the dominating things in people's lives, and whatever religion they have, whoever they vote for, these are the things that affect them. And this almost seems obvious if you talk to workers, or if you think about their situation. The other things fall by the wayside. So I'm hopeful that unionization will continue. We're not yet in a period of massive upsurge, but if it takes place, I think the transplants across the South will unionize just like everybody else.
And it's very trivially correct that the cultural explanations do fall flat. Like when you do actually read, about what's going on here, I mean, just reading even, not labor reporters talking about this that happened in Vance. There's just so much that can be gleaned about how and why these things shake out from actually listening to the workers themselves, as opposed to trying to impose your own politics and worldview and whatever that may be onto these workers and onto these struggles. There's a lot to be said for just listening and kind of figuring out what's going on, as opposed to trying to, make stuff up. So your contention is that it's very material. Typically, the way that these things shake out, it's all kind of derivative of what's going on materially in people's lives. And you opened talking about how the South has gotten or their calling card has been, manufacturers, industries. Come to the South. You can exploit our people. You can take advantage of our people. You can pay them less. You don't have to worry as much about safety. We're not really going to bother you about that. It's not a big deal. And that's how the political elite have been enticing industries to come to the South. And so, you mentioned that one of the real concerns among the folks in these plants is about job loss, either individually or the closure of a plant. And we've seen plants close. We've seen union and non-union plants close. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, a big or a mid-sized manufacturing plant in Hartselle, Alabama. Linamar is I can't remember what they make, but 150 people were laid off. The plant closed, but it was non-union, so people aren't going to be talking about it 20 years later like they do with Dunlop. So, how could you, and this isn't something that I said that I was going to ask you about. So, if you're not prepared for it, then just let us know. But the destruction of the steel industry in the South and in the country has been a big part, or has been a part of the anti-union campaign. And this is something that's really definitely more material than, I like Jesus, so I'm going to vote against the union, right? I mean, there's something real there. What would your response be if you were in the plant, or if you were, on staff with the UAW and folks were talking to you and they were concerned about plant closures because, my daddy or my granddaddy was in a steel mill, was in a steel manufacturing shop, and it was union and it closed down. How can unions and pro-union workers respond to that?
So I think where manufacturing takes place is a result of lots of factors. So the U.S. steel industry lost out. They did not invest in the newest technology. South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s had by far more efficient steel production than places in the U.S. If you look at the places around Pittsburgh and Chicago and Indiana, these were huge old mills where they had put new investment. They were milking the old technology, and they finally became non-competitive. So Alabama was a secondary steel producer, and the problem with the Birmingham area is that the iron ore was less pure, and the coal was not as good for producing steel. So this declined, and it turned out that there were other places in the world with much richer iron ore and lots of access to coal for coke, but particularly the iron ore. So we lost out for a variety of reasons, and I think unions were pretty secondary to this. South Korea is still a major steel producer, and their heavy manufacturing workers are highly unionized and very militant. So while the union factor plays a role, there's lots of complicating things. So, for example, in unionized workplaces, workers quit less often. They have a more reliable workforce. That's a plus for companies that need trained workers and don't want to be replacing workers. So Amazon, for example, decided that high turnover doesn't bother them. People do repetitive physical tasks, loading boxes, this and that. Most of it does not require a skill. On the other hand, working in a steel mill or an auto plant requires more skill and training to do the jobs, and particularly to maintain quality. So there might even be advantages for some of them. But even if we look at the state figures for auto manufacturing jobs, there are about 1 million direct automobile industrial workers in the United States, a little over 1 million. Almost 200,000 of them are still in Michigan, which is by far the state with the highest motor vehicle transportation employment. So they haven't abandoned Michigan to the degree that people claim. Factories have moved out of Detroit, but if you look outside Detroit, where I lived for several decades, there are places in Macomb County where you can go for several miles and all you see are auto plants. And that dwarfs anything in any other state. Alabama is critical. So Alabama, if we don't count Kentucky, which was a border state and I don't consider really the South. Certainly it's not the deep South like Alabama is. Alabama has 45 to 50,000 auto and parts production, fifth highest state in the country. The others tend to be in the Midwest that are above Alabama. So Alabama is central, and auto has lots of ramifications. So while there are 1 million production workers, there are 2 million in sales and retail. There's another 1 million in repair. And there are lots of other feeder industries, rubber, tires, et cetera, that feed the auto industry in ways that steel, for example, don't. You produce steel and that's it. Maybe you make some steel parts in some things, but auto draws upon large percentage of the rest of the economy. So it's really more central than any other industry to the country. So I'm hopeful that Alabama workers will unionize at some point. If a big labor upsurge takes place in the country as a whole, the likelihood increases. But patient work in terms of organizing in the plant, overcoming people's fears in the long run, I think will bear fruit.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. You know, the and one more topic on, you know, why do or don't workers organize is that I wanted to give you some time to speak about was the National Labor Relations Act. I know that's I don't know if you would go so far as to say it's a bailiwick of yours, but it's something that you are, you know, interested in beating back some of the prevailing narratives around the National Labor Relations Act and the effect that it had on unionization. And so if you could just, you know, explain to the audience the popular narrative as you see it surrounding the National Labor Relations Act and then Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. Explain the prevailing narrative as you see it and what the problems are with that narrative.
Okay, so one of the things that people claim, including a lot of unions, is that the laws hold back workers from organizing. My analysis of looking at the long sweep of labor history is that most unionization takes place during massive upsurges. The period during and right after World War I, when union membership doubled. The period in the 1930s, starting with the organization of coal miners before Section 7A had even passed, 600,000 coal miners in the country unionized from a union that was seen to be falling apart. You had these massive radical-led strikes in 1934, the San Francisco General Strike and West Coast Longshoremen, a Toledo auto light strike where 30,000 people picketed and fought the National Guard, the Minneapolis Teamster strike, and then the Flint strike where workers in Flint, Michigan, which was the heart of General Motors production facilities, seized their plant and said they were willing to die if the troops came in. So these things led to massive labor upsurges, even without any really enabling legislation. Another example seems to me teacher organizing, which is among the most highly unionized occupation in the country today. Before 1960, there were hardly any teachers unionized. In late 1960, in December, 50,000 teachers in New York City, which had, contrary to popular opinion, had the most repressive labor legislation for state and local employees. 50,000 teachers went out. The New York City political leaders were afraid to enforce the legislation because there was the strike was unanimous. Before that, there were hardly any teachers organized. Within months, every big city in the country had a militant American Federation of Teachers local, and teachers unionism spread throughout the country. And it spread even before there was any enabling legislation in virtually any state. Most states hit 70% unionization before any laws were passed. So I don't see that these laws, and the laws today certainly aren't as draconian as earlier laws used to be. So, yeah, some of the laws may make it more difficult, but when union workers decide to organize, the laws fall by the wayside. So I don't see labor law reform as very important in terms of preventing or helping unionization. So that's my cut in looking at these things historically. And I think there's an overemphasis on people thinking that the laws will help them as opposed to organizing and mass struggle.
And, speaking of the laws, moving to politics kind of more broadly, there's this one fellow online that has an opinion that a lot of people have, which is that unions are not these, more broadly important organizations. They are narrow, self-serving institutions said neutrally, right? The fellow who says this, he's not trying to say it in a bad way necessarily. He's just saying, look, unions, they serve their members. They don't really do all that much else. So sometimes they do good things, sometimes they do bad things, but they do it for their members. And that's basically it. There's not really any greater benefit to society from unions or, unionization or anything like that. And I do not believe that. That does not seem to me to be the case. And one of the things that you have pointed out in your book is, Alabama exceptionalism, how Alabama in the South was uniquely unionized and workers had more power in Alabama through that strong labor movement, and there were broader gains experienced by non-union people in Alabama from the political power and the economic power of the labor movement here in Alabama. Can you just, respond to that claim of unions unions not really super important, narrow, self-serving institutions, sometimes good, sometimes bad?
No, I think you're right. Alabama is the perfect example. Once coal miners, so the most militant groups earliest to organize, first were coal miners, steel workers in the Birmingham area, iron ore miners in the counties around Birmingham. And these unions look to support struggles all over the state. They help the farmers union organize. They help school teachers organize. They help people all over. There's an interesting story. So Gadsden became a highly unionized area. In 1947, it had 60,000 people, 10,000 of whom were members of the CIO. When laundry workers went out, several hundred laundry workers went on strike, the company fired them all and tried to bring in scabs. Thousands of workers from other industries steel, textile, came and joined the picket lines and forced the company to rehire the workers. So it's just not true that unions, particularly in Alabama, have only looked out for their own members. They've looked out for everybody. The other thing in Alabama, under Folsom, the union movement forced the country to force the state to pass the broadest workmen's compensation law in the country. And in particular, it was the only state in the country that had black lung, which is what most older miners die of because it keeps them from breathing and debilitates them, as a compensated disease from work. Other places, other states refuse to recognize that as an actual workplace disease. So the other thing, it forced education reforms, highways, lots of things throughout the state that made, some of which in terms of the university system still remain in the state, even from long ago. So I think the union movement, even when the unions were not that radical, and the radical unions tended to push for more, but even when they weren't that radical, it looked out for broad interests of working class people in the state as a whole. So I think that's a common feature of union history in the South and elsewhere. The other thing that unionization had forced non-union employers to wages and benefits. And if we look at the Detroit area, Detroit, at the heyday of the auto industry in Michigan, 1940s, 1950s, had not only the highest pay per capita of workers in general, but the smallest gaps between black and white workers in general. It had the highest degree of home ownership of any city in the country, the highest degree of non-white home ownership. So these are broad societal gains that unions have come to deliver for working class people. And this is actually fairly common today, that there are many people now arguing that the economic inequality and the huge disparity between the rich and the poor has grown worse as unionization has declined in the country over the past several decades.
Right.
So this is a non-empirical argument that people give. I mean, I hear this all the time. People say, railroad unions want more people so they can have feather bedding. Well, they have these huge trains, right, that are prone to accidents. And railroad companies want only one person on these trains that go for miles and miles. Right. And the unions say, if you don't have at least two people, when you have an accident or something happens, you can't even deal with it. One person cannot deal with an accident like that. Companies say, we've automated everything, you don't have to worry. But there are railroad people killed and there are railroad accidents. So in this place in Ohio where the train derailed and there were, 10 or 15 cars full of dangerous chemicals, which they were worried would kill lots of people, and was burned off. The company just settled for several $100 million because of the accident. And these things are all too common.
Right. Right. And so, circling back to today, what do you think workers and unions and supporters in the community should take from your work? What lessons should we learn and apply as we're talking to our coworkers? Do you feel like, these are lessons that the UAW has learned, from their own study of history or from other people or from you? Are we in a moment of potential upsurge, where, like you said, in the past, millions of people have come to unions and organized? What does the recent BLS statistics tell us about the moment that we're in? How can we, apply some of the lessons of history to the moment that we're in?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of exciting things going on, but we're not yet in a period of upsurge. So we can look at the different sectors which are been mobilizing. Certainly, I think the Starbucks and other retail workers, REI, Trader Joe's, whatnot, that's exciting. But these workers have very little leverage, what I call structural power in the economy. There are 10 to 15,000 Starbucks places in the country. That's out of 40,000 coffee houses, not counting Dunkin' Donuts and some of the other places that sell coffee. So even if these people were all organized and went on strike, they wouldn't keep anybody from getting coffee. And that's why there's so much more hype about the auto industry. The other industries that are important are the logistics industry. This is the whole warehouse and delivery system, of which Amazon is at the pinnacle of which there was also a big battle in Bessemer, which was a former stronghold of the mine, mill, and smelter workers, a left-wing, very militant union. So these types of places have lots of structural power and leverage. But in the present period, people have to spend a lot of time doing careful internal organizing, building up their support, which it sounds like from the union's own self-criticism, they didn't do enough of in advance. They thought, according to their statement, that if they called a quick election, that they could take the company by storm, which they didn't do. And I think that aside from the inside thing, all of us, and particularly those of us in unions in an area, giving all the support we can to organizing campaigns that are going on. And that's the history in Alabama. These more powerful unions gave support to workers who didn't have the leverage that they did. Coal miners and steel workers gave support to textile, which doesn't have the leverage that those unions have. So I think these are interesting times, important for us all to be involved, important that radio programs like yours, if there are other ones like yours, but certainly your radio program publicizing labor events as they go on, keeping people aware. I mean, one of the interesting things about Alabama is that it seems to me, and you know more about this than I do, but in talking to people, people are very unaware of the militant, broad labor history that Alabama has. Right. And that's in contrast to a place like West Virginia, where people are much more conscious of the history of militant mine worker organizing. Interestingly, when the teachers in West Virginia statewide went on strike a few years ago, a lot of them had signs from their coal worker organizing in which their parents or grandparents had been involved in. Right. So I think also making people aware of the culture and history of unionization in Alabama is really important, because people have something to identify with and don't have to think about all the noise from contemporary politics, much of which isn't very helpful or inspiring.
Right. Professor Goldfield, really appreciate your time. It's been great. Look forward to continuing to keep the conversation going in the future. Always feel free to reach out if you feel like there's anything that you know.
Yeah, no, thank you. I also want to say, if people do want a copy of my recent book on Southern labor organizing, there is a discount flyer available, which I guess they can get from you.
Yes, there's a discount flyer. We will we'll post it on Twitter and Facebook, and you can order it at oup.com, Oxford University Press, oup.com, with the promo code AAFLYG6, AAFLYG6, and you'll get 30% off. That's
pretty good deal.
That's a pretty good
really
deal.
Worth it.
I paid full price for it.
Yeah, Jacob and I both paid full price. Happy to do so. It was well worth it. Professor Goldfield, really appreciate your time and all your work, particularly elevating the stories of Alabama. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, and you guys keep up the great work that you're doing.
Yes,
Appreciate
sir.
it.
Will do.
Professor Goldfield, author of The Southern Key, Class, Race, and Radicalism in the 1930s and 40s. Check it out. It's a great book. One of the best I've read in a long time. Really good stuff. A very compelling read. You know, not only is there a lot of great information in there, but it's an easy read. It's compelling. It's interesting. So, you know, didn't want to put it down. So definitely recommend checking it out. OUP.com with promo code AAFLYG6 for 30% off.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.